Marcus Dunbar stood frozen as the bank manager tore his $5 million check in half, right in front of his 8-year-old daughter. "Men like you don't walk in here with this kind of money," she said, looking him up and down like he didn't belong. Naomi's small hand gripped his sleeve, her eyes wide with fear she'd never shown before. Then the manager picked up the phone and called the police, accusing him of fraud. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked at her and said she'd just made the most expensive mistake of her career. What none of them knew was that the man they were about to drag out of that bank held more power over that building's future than anyone in the room could imagine. The pieces of the check settled on the tile, and for a moment nobody in the lobby moved. Then the security guard, a heavy-set man named Victor, who had been standing near the door all afternoon without saying a word, stepped forward and rested his hand near Marcus's elbow. "Sir, I need you to come with me," Victor said, his voice quieter than the moment called for, as if some part of him already sensed this was wrong. "Now, Victor," Priya Whitfield snapped from behind the counter, her tone sharp enough to end any hesitation before it could grow into something else. Marcus didn't resist. He had learned a long time ago that resisting in a room full of strangers with their phones raised only wrote a different story than the true one. He kept his hand wrapped around Naomi's instead, feeling her fingers tremble. "Daddy," she whispered, looking up at him. "Are we in trouble?" He knelt slightly, just enough to meet her eyes without letting go of her hand. "We didn't do anything wrong," he told her, his voice steady in the exact way it had been steady through every hard night of the last 6 years. "Sometimes people make mistakes about other people. That's all this is." "But she said you stole it." "I know what she said." His jaw tightened, the only crack in his composure. "It isn't true, and it won't stay standing much longer." Near the entrance, a woman kept her phone raised, filming, her thumb hovering as if she wasn't sure whether to keep recording or feel ashamed of herself. Nobody lowered their phone. Nobody stepped forward either. Before we go any further, if this story is already sitting heavy in your chest, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the next few minutes inside this branch is about to change more than one life in that lobby, and you won't want to miss where it goes. 6 years before that afternoon, Marcus Dunbar had been a different kind of tired. Not the tired that comes from building something, but the tired that comes from watching something fall apart. His wife left on an ordinary Tuesday, taking a suitcase and leaving behind a note shorter than the silence that followed it. Naomi had been too. She wouldn't remember any of it, and that was the only mercy Marcus ever thanked anyone for during those years. What she would remember, what she would grow up simply knowing as true, was that her father was the one who showed up. Every recital, every school project, every fever at 2 in the morning. Nobody in Maple Hollow knew that the man dropping his daughter off in a decade-old jacket ran a firm that quietly managed more money than most people in that town would see across 3 generations combined. He kept the truck. He kept the coat. He'd made a private decision, somewhere in the wreckage of his marriage, that Naomi would never grow up believing a person's worth could be read off a price tag. It was working, until a Tuesday morning, almost exactly like the one that had ended his marriage, when a very different kind of number landed in his account. A technology company he'd quietly backed years earlier, back when it was 3 people and an idea nobody believed in, had gone public. His early stake had turned into a check for $5 million. He already knew where it was going. Half would sit untouched for Naomi's future. The other half would seed something he'd carried in his chest since the year his wife left. A scholarship fund for kids being raised the way Naomi was, by one parent doing the work of 2. He hadn't planned on today being complicated. He'd promised her 3 books instead of the usual one because he was in a good mood, because the bank stop was supposed to take 10 minutes, then the bookstore, then dinner at the diner on 5th Street, the same 3 stops Naomi had been narrating since breakfast, like a countdown to something far bigger than 3 paperback books and a plate of pancakes. "Can I get the one with the dragon on it?" she asked from the back seat. her backpack already unzipped and half-packed with nothing, just habit, just the excitement of a good day ahead. "You can get 3, Marcus said, glancing at her in the mirror. "Since I'm in a good mood, why are you in a good mood?" "Because my daughter is going to pick out 3 books today, instead of complaining about only getting 1. Naomi grinned, the gap where her front tooth used to be still catching the light every time she smiled too wide. She didn't know about the check folded carefully in the inside pocket of her father's jacket. She didn't know what it meant, what it had taken 6 quiet years to build toward, or that half of it was already, in her father's mind, hers. The Ellsworth branch of Holstead National sat at the corner of 5th and Miller, a building Marcus had walked into more times than he could count over 15 years. He knew the tellers by name, most of them anyway, the ones who'd been there longer than a few months. He knew where the pens were kept, which door stuck a little in the winter, which corner of the parking lot got the most shade in July. He did not know Priya Whitfield. She had transferred in 3 weeks earlier from a branch 2 counties over, and in 3 weeks she had not once pulled up his file, had never had a reason to, because in 3 weeks Marcus Dunbar had not once needed anything from that bank beyond the ordinary. Today was not ordinary. He held the door for Naomi and let her walk in first, the way he always did, watching her scan the lobby the way she scanned every new room, cataloging details the way she cataloged everything, the number of chairs, the color of the carpet, the sound the automatic doors made when they closed behind them. "Nobody's saying hi," she said quietly, tugging his sleeve as they approached the counter. 3 tellers stood at their stations. None of them looked up. "They're busy," Marcus said, though even he wasn't sure that was true. A man in a pressed gray suit walked in behind them and was greeted before he'd taken 3 full steps into the lobby. Marcus noticed. Naomi noticed more. "Why did that man get help right away?" she whispered. "Be patient," Marcus told her. The same thing he always told her. The thing he'd been telling himself in different rooms for most of his adult life. It doesn't pay to assume the worst about people before they've done anything to earn it. When they finally reached the counter, Marcus placed the check down and asked for it to be deposited into the account he'd held for 15 years. The number caught the teller's eye immediately, and within seconds, a woman in a charcoal blazer was standing behind the counter, studying him the way a person studies something they've already decided is broken. "Where did this come from?" Priya asked, her voice pitched loud enough that half the lobby could hear it. "It's from the sale of an early investment," Marcus said evenly. "I have documentation, driver's license, account number, the paperwork from the issuing bank. You're welcome to call and verify it yourself. It'll take a few minutes." Priya looked at the papers without really looking at them. "A man carrying $5 million doesn't usually drive what you drove into this parking lot," she said, "or wear a coat like that." A young teller near the end of the counter, Lucas Reyes, leaned forward. "I can make the verification call," he offered. "Get back to your station," Priya said, without so much as glancing at him. Marcus felt Naomi's hand tighten around 2 of his fingers. He kept his voice level. "Please make the call," he said, "before this goes any further." She heard it as a threat instead of a warning. In front of the tellers, in front of the security guard standing near the door, in front of every customer who had already begun raising their phones, Priya announced that the check was fraudulent, though she had not verified a single detail of it. "Men like you don't walk in here with this kind of money," she said, and reached for the check and tore it in half, and then into smaller pieces, letting them fall to the floor at his feet, in full view of his daughter. The lobby went silent, except for the low hum of the overhead lights and the quiet click of at least 3 phones now recording. Naomi bent down, as if to gather the pieces, but Marcus stopped her gently, unwilling to let her kneel on that floor for what someone had used to humiliate him. "You've just made the most expensive mistake of your career," he told her, without raising his voice. Priya picked up the phone and called the police, telling the dispatcher that a man was attempting fraud and refusing to leave the premises. Then she turned to Victor. "Escort him out." Victor hesitated, just long enough for it to matter, before stepping forward and resting his hand near Marcus's elbow. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Marcus didn't fight it. He knelt slightly to meet Naomi's eyes, keeping his hand around hers, telling her quietly that everything would be fine as long as she stayed close. She nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the torn paper scattered near their feet, remnants of a scholarship fund that hadn't even had the chance to exist yet. As Victor walked them toward the glass doors, Naomi looked back once more, then up at the rows of customers still filming with their phones raised and their eyes lowered. "Nobody's going to say he didn't do anything wrong," she said, quiet enough that Marcus almost missed it, loud enough that it landed on him harder than anything Priya had said all afternoon. Nobody answered her. Nobody moved. Marcus felt that silence settle into his chest the way nothing else in that lobby had. This had stopped being about a check. He understood, watching his daughter's face, that she was learning something about the world that no 8-year-old should have to learn on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. They were 3 steps from the door when it swung open, and a man in a dark coat walked in with a leather briefcase and the unhurried posture of someone expecting an uneventful meeting. His eyes moved from the torn paper on the floor to Naomi's tear-streaked face to Marcus. The briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the tile with a heavy, unmistakable thud. "Mr. Dunbar," he said, and the temperature of the entire room changed at once. Victor's hand dropped away from Marcus's arm, as though it had suddenly become something he had no right to touch. Priya moved toward the man in the dark coat, already explaining, already reaching for control of the story before it slipped any further out of her hands. "Mr. Castellano, I just prevented what I believe was a $5 million fraud attempt. Do you have any idea who you're talking about?" Owen Castellano asked, his voice carrying across the lobby with an authority that made every head turn. Priya opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at Marcus, then at Naomi, then back at Owen, searching for some version of the last 10 minutes that might still make sense. "This is Marcus Dunbar," Owen said, loud enough for the whole room. "Founder of Dunbar Capital Group, one of this bank's largest institutional clients. We are 3 days from closing a $750 million agreement, and he is the only person with the authority to walk away from it." He paused. "The check was legitimate. The issuing bank confirmed it this morning. There was never a fraud here, Priya. There was only a man standing at your counter." He crossed the lobby and knelt down in front of Naomi, lowering himself to her eye level. "I'm sorry," he told her simply. "What happened to you and your dad today should never have happened, in this building or anywhere else." It was the first time since the doors closed behind them that anyone had spoken to Naomi as though her fear mattered. She looked up at her father, checking, the way she always did, whether it was safe to believe someone. "You can believe him," Marcus said quietly. The customers who'd been filming lowered their phones, though none of them deleted the footage. A man near the entrance, who'd loudly suggested Marcus was using his own daughter to run a scam, now stared at his shoes, saying nothing. Priya straightened her blazer, composing herself with the practiced speed of someone used to talking her way out of consequences. "He should have identified himself the moment he walked in," she said. "If he dressed the part." "Name the procedure," Owen said flatly, gesturing at the torn paper still scattered on the tile, "that authorizes a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his child." Priya said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Behind her, Lucas Reyes had already stepped away from his station. "Sir," he said to Owen, "the cameras caught all of it. Every angle. I can pull the footage now if you need it." Priya's face went pale. She'd forgotten the cameras entirely. Owen terminated her on the spot. Not privately. Not in some back office where the consequences might quietly disappear, but right there, in front of the same people who'd watched her tear the check apart minutes earlier. "You humiliated a customer and his daughter in public," he told her. "You'll answer for it in public." To Victor, his approach was gentler. The footage showed he'd never used force, had released Marcus the instant Owen spoke. Owen suspended him pending review rather than firing him outright. "I knew something felt wrong," Victor admitted quietly, mostly to himself. "I just didn't trust it enough to say so." Marcus, still holding Naomi against his side, found he had no anger left for the guard who had at least hesitated, unlike the woman who'd given the order. The police arrived not long after, responding to Priya's original call. An officer took Marcus's statement, apologizing under his breath for how the dispatch report had made the situation sound. Lucas gave his account without softening a single detail, including the moment Priya had threatened to fire him for offering to make a verification call. The woman who'd filmed the confrontation handed her footage over voluntarily, admitting she should have said something the moment the questioning started, instead of only reaching for her phone. A 10-second clip of the check being torn apart while Naomi watched was already online before the officers finished taking statements. By the time Marcus and Naomi left the branch that evening, it had thousands of views. By the next morning, it had reached far beyond Maple Hollow. News vans appeared outside the Ellsworth branch before the week was out. Reporters learned that Marcus was a single father who'd raised his daughter alone for 6 years, and that the $5 million Priya had torn apart was meant to seed a scholarship for children being raised by one parent doing the work of two. The contrast between what the money was meant to do and how its owner had been treated only deepened the outrage, spreading with every share. An internal investigation opened within days, and it found far more than one bad afternoon. Priya had a documented history of freezing accounts and escalating confrontations disproportionately with customers who looked like Marcus, complaints that had been filed and quietly closed by branch leadership long before he ever walked through those doors. A former teller who'd left the branch nearly 2 years earlier came forward, describing an almost identical incident involving an elderly customer whose account Priya had frozen without explanation. That complaint, too, had been closed within a week, buried in a file nobody had reason to reopen until a $5 million check ended up torn on the same lobby floor. What had looked like one manager's mistake was quickly becoming proof of something the bank had allowed to continue, unchecked, for years. Lawyers arrived at Marcus's house 3 days later with an offer already prepared. A settlement, a public apology, several terminations, all in exchange for one condition. He would sign the deal as planned and say nothing further about what had happened inside that branch. Marcus let them finish. In the next room, Naomi did her homework quietly, unaware that grown men were negotiating over how to make her fear disappear from a news cycle. He thought about the question she'd asked him at the kitchen table 3 nights earlier, the one that had followed him into every quiet moment since, whether anyone would have apologized at all if he hadn't turned out to be rich. He had no honest answer for her then, and he still didn't. But he understood, sitting across from the lawyers, that punishing Priya and pressuring the bank into an apology would satisfy his own anger without changing anything for the next person who walked into that lobby, without a Owen Castellano arriving in time to vouch for them. "I don't want the settlement," Marcus told them. "I'm not interested in being paid to stay quiet." Instead, he laid out conditions that had nothing to do with his own bank account. Independent audits for discriminatory conduct, done by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office. A second manager's approval required before any account could be frozen or denied. Protection for employees who reported wrongdoing, a condition he insisted on because of what he'd watched happen to Lucas. Frontline staff training on recognizing and refusing an order that was clearly wrong, and a permanent fund for single-parent families, seeded with the very money that had once been torn apart on that lobby floor. The board resisted at first, but with the deal and the bank's reputation both hanging in the balance, they had little room left to negotiate. Within the week, every condition had been accepted. Priya's banking license was revoked. She now faced a discrimination lawsuit and a charge for filing a false police report. Victor was reinstated once the footage confirmed what everyone already knew, and placed into the very training program Marcus had insisted on. When Marcus saw him again weeks later, Victor apologized quietly, admitting he wished he'd trusted his own instincts sooner. "There's nothing to apologize for," Marcus told him. "I remember your hand never tightened. That's not nothing." Lucas was promoted, put in charge of rolling the new training program out across the region, all because he'd been the only person in that lobby willing to say something while everyone else stayed silent. The sharpest moment, though, didn't come from the board or the headlines. It came from Naomi, weeks after the story had already started to fade from the news cycle. As she sat across from her father at their kitchen table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. "Would they have said sorry?" she asked. "If you weren't rich?" Marcus set down his fork. He had no answer that wouldn't feel like a lie. He'd been cleared because he happened to hold power most people never would. Thousands of people walked into banks, just like that one, every day without an Owen Castellano arriving to call them sir. "I don't know," he told her honestly, because she deserved that more than she deserved comfort. "But I'm going to spend some time trying to make sure it matters less whether they would." 3 months later, Marcus and Naomi walked back through the same glass doors. He still drove the same truck, still wore the same coat, refusing to change anything about himself, simply because the world had briefly decided his appearance mattered more than it should have. The bank looked different in ways that went beyond fresh paint. An employee greeted them before either of them said a word. Nobody's eyes lingered on his jacket or his keys. A placard near the entrance listed customer rights in plain language, alongside a number for an independent complaint line. Lucas came over in his new role to say hello, mentioning that staff training had already rolled out to every branch in the region. Victor stood near the door in uniform, and when he caught sight of Marcus, he gave a small, genuine nod. A young mother stood at the counter, opening her son's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion Marcus and Naomi had faced 3 months earlier. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Naomi watched the scene for a long moment before turning to her father. "Is that why you didn't just close this whole bank down?" Marcus thought about it before answering, wanting her to actually understand rather than simply hear him. "Closing a door is easy," he said. "Making it open for everyone is harder." She nodded slowly, the way she did when she was turning an idea over rather than simply accepting it. He let her hand the very first scholarship letter to a young boy being raised by his father alone. And Naomi's face changed as she understood, maybe for the first time, that the $5 million had never been what made her father matter. What mattered was that he'd had the power to seek revenge, and chosen instead to make sure the next family through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. They walked out together, finally continuing the plan interrupted 3 months earlier, the bookstore, then the diner on 5th Street. Naomi held her father's hand the same way she had that first afternoon, though there was nothing tense in her grip this time, only the easy comfort of a girl walking beside her dad on an ordinary errand. If you'd been standing in that lobby the day it all began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone? Or would you have been the first to stand up for a father and his daughter? A person should never need $5 million to be treated with basic respect. Marcus didn't win the day a stranger recognized his name. The real victory came only once he used that recognition to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated fairly, no matter who they were or what they drove into the parking lot. If this story moved you, subscribe to Single Dad Story Room for more, and carry this lesson with you the next time you're standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated.